Just a minute. Okay.
Are we live?
Yep.
Brilliant. Well, Bore da pawb. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very first session of the Green Recovery Festival for Wales. My name is Katie Jo Luxton. I'm Director of RSPB Cymru, which is one of the many organisations that have come together to organise this festival, this virtual festival. And in a few moments, I'm hoping that the First Minister will be joining us virtually and that he will be here to help us launch this festival with his own thoughts about green recovery. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Justin Albert, who is Director of the National Trust in Wales. And Justin will be talking us through what we're going to expect this week. And apologies, I have some noisy cars outside in the centre of Cardiff here. But just to set the context for today, I suppose this festival has come about because COVID-19 has precipitated such a huge change in our way of life, and it's been a really cruel and difficult time as we have managed this pandemic, but it has turned our way of life upside down. And in a way that none of us in the conservation sector could ever have imagined, the response to this pandemic has shown that when everyone comes together, we can make really big changes to systems that otherwise seem set in stone. And I suppose as a conservationist, it's sometimes very hard to conceive of the change we need to live in harmony with nature. And if on the positive sides from the pandemic, one of the things that I take from it is renewed hope that us humans can respond to really big threats and challenges like the pandemic, and that we can come together to bring about the change we need to tackle the crises in the natural world. And the crisis that is facing us in terms of both climate change and the loss of nature is really stark and urgent. 2 years ago, the United Nations stated that we had 12 years left to halt an irreversible climate and ecological catastrophe. And since then, there have only been more bleak warnings that the world's biodiversity is facing real tipping points, more than 1 million plant and animal species becoming extinct, and 17% of Welsh biodiversity and species are at risk of extinction as well. So the scale of action that we need is really significant. And as we start to emerge from the coronavirus crisis, we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to try and build back better and create a new normal that works for both nature and people. And we must remember some of the lessons that the coronavirus has taught us. We've got to respect nature and our natural world, and then or risk continuing these risks, because we believe the disease has come from the threats that nature has faced by animals and humans being pushed closer together as we've lost their habitat. And climate change will see massive loss of species as well, and a changing climate again bringing humans and nature into closer proximity and facing greater pressures. And it highlights the fact that we need to respond to this emergency and grow back in a way that removes some of the pressures that the natural world is facing. And we believe that's possible. And I also think that one of the other big lessons for me that I've taken very positively from coronavirus crisis has been just how positive having more time to connect with nature has been. And we've seen a huge response on social media around how people have reconnected with nature and seen how good it's been for their well-being as they've been out and about, either those fortunate enough to have gardens or those able to take walks in parks near them. And we've really seen that access to biodiverse green space near people's houses is really improving people's health and well-being. And I really want to ride that public support to make the case for green recovery. So we believe now that some of the change that perhaps we thought wasn't possible in the green movement is possible. So many of those blockages and barriers that have hindered the meaningful response to nature and climate have been shown to be just that. They're blockages and barriers. We can aim higher. And I think for me, that sets the frame for this festival around green recovery this week. We can call for bigger, bolder things. We mustn't limit our ambition. We can achieve this scale of change. And I hope when the First Minister is able to join us, that the scale of cultural, social, economic change is something that he feels proud and excited to lead. And I'm hoping to hear that in his talk. So this comes around because, oh, he's just joining us now. That's great, perfectly timed. This festival has come about because we weren't clear what would replace the Royal Welsh Show. And the Royal Welsh Show is a time of year in Wales where we celebrate farming and the countryside and the wonders of our rural Wales. And we wanted to take the moment as we recover from COVID to reflect on how the pressures and challenges we have at the moment in a health crisis, a climate crisis and a nature crisis, and think about how we can recover together with a green recovery. And so without further ado, it's with great pleasure that I'm going to welcome our First Minister Mark Drakeford to open the Green Recovery Festival for us in Wales and to share his thoughts on a green recovery. And I'll just, before I hand over to the First Minister, we haven't had time for catch up before this. So I can either pose the questions you've seen beforehand to you in an interview style, or if you're happy to, we can open the floor to you and you can answer the questions in your talk, First Minister. Which would you prefer? Can you hear us, First Minister? Oh, at the end of a very long room.
And I hope you might be able to see me as well. The website has come and gone a bit during the few minutes I've been watching, so let's hope we've got a stable connection now. Katie Jo, just two things. Do you have simultaneous translation going on?
We do not on this. We're operating only in English today.
A lot of my notes for this have been given to me in Welsh, so I would have used them if you had, but I won't if you don't. And shall I look, all I want to do is just to say a few things at the beginning. I'm very happy then to, if you want to put the questions to me, then I'm happy to try and cover those things in that way. So I guess the first thing is just to say thank you for the invitation to join you, and congratulations to everybody who has taken part in making the Green Recovery Festival happen. Coronavirus has been an enormous challenge to us all in so many ways, but it has at the same time demonstrated a huge creativity in the way that people have found different ways of coming together, different ways of exploring things. I took part in a virtual event at the Hay Festival back in the end of May. Normally, you know, we'd have been 100 of us in a tent. I think there were 2,000 people watching that event. So in some ways, you know, we're finding different ways of reaching out and engaging more people in some of these discussions and conversations than we would have by more conventional ways. It is obviously sad not to be at the showground itself, with all the excitement that it brings and all the opportunities that go with it. But congratulations to everybody who's made this happen in its place. I was listening to the introduction and agreeing as I was listening that despite the very real sadnesses that coronavirus has brought to so many families, and the challenges that will be there for the rest of this year, and the undoubted prospects that we will face a second wave and further real challenges in the autumn and winter, we still have to work hard to try and learn and put to work the positive things that have come out of it. And in the Welsh Government, we are very determined, for example, not to go back to 2,000 people trying to travel into the building I am in at 8:30 in the morning and all leave at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We have about 100 people working here, and everybody else is working remotely. And that's environmentally good as well as good in lots of other ways, and it's one of the positive lessons that we want to try and make sure that we hang on to here. But in all the other ways that I heard being mentioned, the opportunities that people have had themselves to make contact again with the natural world around them, whether that's in their own absolutely immediate environment or whether it is more generally, is something we need to capture and build from. And the festival will be an important part of that. What we don't want to see is that as life begins to get back to whatever normal might be, that people forget those things and revert to ways of behaving and doing that were there before the crisis and need not be there in the future. So inside the Welsh Government, we are very keen as part of our recovery programme led by Jeremy Miles to make environmental justice one of the 3 pillars of our recovery plan: economic justice, social justice and environmental justice. 3 interlinked themes that we want to make front and centre of how Wales emerges from the whole experience. Putting sustainability, reduction in carbon emissions, a meaningful response to the climate crisis, being serious about the threat to biodiversity, putting all of those things right in the middle of the way we plan to emerge from all of this. In doing so, we have fought very hard to hang on to a series of programmes that we had developed through last year's budget round. Some of you will remember that we had made a real effort in the way we approach setting the budget for this financial year on to take into account cross-cutting things across the whole government. And we had managed to find £140 million in capital money to invest in the biodiversity and climate change crises, with a series of programmes emerging from that investment. Now, the Welsh Government is affected by, as much as anybody else, by the coronavirus crisis, with lots of people unable to be in work because of illness or shielding, or family members needing to be looked after, and being taken away from other jobs to focus on coronavirus itself. But we have fought very hard inside the government, Leslie Griffiths as the minister responsible, to hang on to those investments and to find ways of creating a platform, therefore, for what we will want to do as we emerge the other side. So our Local Places for Nature scheme, which I see already working in Riverside, part of Cardiff, that I work in, or investment in Natura sites in trying to make good some of the depredations in the most important biodiversity sites we have in Wales. Our plans for a national forest. I'm not going to just name them all, but there are a series of things which we had committed to before the crisis hit us, which we have struggled to protect that money and those programs from the overwhelming experience that coronavirus has created. And as I say, our aim is that that will provide a platform for us as we emerge the other side to make a green recovery a reality of the way in which we want to shape the Wales of the future, shaped by our underpinning legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the Environment Act, and so on. And the work of the festival and all the discussions that there will be particularly important. And in reading about it, I was very struck by the focus of the group not being on the sort of background to all of this, but on the practical actions, the things that can happen on the ground that will make a difference and will help us to draw people into that whole experience by making them part of the solution, rather than people for whom the solution is, invented and done too. So thank you all very much for that. I look forward very much to seeing the results of it and to be helping the Welsh Government to play its part in everything that we need to do together.
Thank you very much, Mark. You've set out an ambition there, and I think the Welsh Government was one of the first governments in the world to recognise the climate emergency. One of the questions we've got here, which is perhaps a bit of a pointy stick question because it's a yes or no answer, which is always tough, I know, but it says that the Welsh Government recognised the climate emergency. Do you recognise this as a dual crisis with the loss of nature, and will you upgrade your climate declaration to be a dual nature and climate emergency in your response?
Well, I think I've always thought that the threat to biodiversity and the threat from climate change are two sides of the same coin. I haven't thought specifically about the question about upgrading, if that is the right word, the declaration we've made. But I have always regarded the two things as part of the same agenda. As I said, lots of the practical things that we have been planning to do and are still going to go and do have been in the biodiversity, the loss of it, the impact on nature, and all of those things. So I've got no problem at all in agreeing with the general proposition, because I think it is the way we think about it here.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's very true. I mean, the climate change is an example, one of the many examples of the pressures we humans are putting on the natural world. You're absolutely right. You announced over the weekend that your intention is not to stay for the whole of the next term. So this question about your legacy, if you look back and said, what would be the thing that you want for your legacy in terms of creating a green recovery, what would be your, well, this person said top 3 things, but you can choose however you like. If you would look back and say at the end of your term what you would have achieved for the green recovery.
Well, the first thing to say is these are never personal achievements, are they? Most of the things that I would think of are the result of collective effort by Welsh citizens in their everyday lives, in which government helps to create the conditions in which that contribution can be made. But it's so for me, it is things, I guess, looking over the period of devolution. It is where we started and where we currently are in relation to recycling. It is things like, I wonder how many Welsh citizens would actually make a guess at how much less energy we use today compared to 2005 when we first started keeping a record of it in this way. So we use 11% less energy in Wales than we did back then. And I think that would surprise quite a lot of people if we'd said that to them, but it is the result of collective effort. So as I say, most of the things that I think I look back on as our big achievements are things that we've created together. And it is partly why, in what I said in the beginning, that the way we will make a difference in the future is by persuading our neighbours and our friends and everybody else to be part of an ongoing collective effort to make a difference. Government by itself will never achieve what is needed to be achieved here. So amongst the things that we would want to do, I think, collectively, would be to persuade people in Wales that the renewable energy future that we can create together is something that we should make a priority and invest in collectively. It's part of my enthusiasm for a national forest, because I think you need some things that inspire people that are symbolic of that. The coastal path is already that, isn't it? The fact that we created a path where you can walk right along the whole fantastic coast of Wales. For many, many people who've never done any of it, perhaps, the fact that we can do it in Wales has been a really important sort of symbol of what we can manage together. And for me, the National Forest wants to be the same sort of thing, wants to demonstrate to people, it will give them that sense of collective achievement, what we can manage when we work together. And if you think of threes, then a third thing in that space, we have real ambitions here in the Welsh Government for sustainable housing, for the way in which we are desperately short of some sorts of housing, particularly housing for people who just don't have the type of accommodation that we would regard as decent and capable of sustaining a life that has prospects and ambition and meaning and so on, but to do that in a sustainable way. Houses as power stations, all of those sorts of things. Well, it's a journey we will have to take people on alongside us and with us. If we could do a bit of that, then I think I'd be very pleased to look back and think that some of those things started while I was around.
Thank you. There's a lot of ambition in there. And one of the questions we've got actually touches a bit on the point you've made about renewable energy. So a lot of people are very supportive in scaling up renewable energy in Wales and want to see a real step change. But sometimes we've seen some sort of challenges between rushing towards renewable energy in ways that can cause damage to the natural world. And there have been some particular challenges around the marine environment and deploying novel technologies in the marine environment. We've got a question here which says, how do we make sure we can deploy renewable energy at scale in ways that doesn't harm our already fragile natural world? Are there ways that can even bring around a net recovery of our biodiversity?
Well, this is a very tricky issue and people feel powerfully about it. My own starting point is to go back to the question I think you asked me first, which is the biodiversity and climate change as two sides of the same coin. There is no greater threat to our marine environment than climate change. And if we're not prepared to do something about the precipitating causes of climate change, then the damage that may be done by experimental devices in the marine environment will be absolutely as nothing compared to the impact on the marine environment of sea temperatures rising and everything that goes with it. So, I think we've got to look at both of those aspects together. The marine environment is particularly tricky because in some ways the only way we will ever learn is by doing. So I think we need to be able to agree ways of proceeding, particularly at the experimental stages, where devices that we will deploy in the marine environment are modest enough in scale that any adverse effects, and obviously you do everything you can in advance to try and plan that there aren't adverse effects, but because this is by nature an experiment, you can't account for everything. So if there were any unintended, unanticipated adverse effects, the scale of the experiment must be modest enough that any damage is contained, and the monitoring of devices must be good enough that they can be switched off and removed as soon as adverse impacts are identified. But I just don't think it is possible to provide cast iron guarantees against every eventuality in technologies that have never been tried anywhere in the world. So some learning by doing is necessary if we are to make the most of the opportunities we have. They have to be carefully crafted. They have to be done with a lot of oversight, and they must be capable of being reversed if adverse effects are discovered. But none of that does not, in my mind, amount to a bar on having experiments, because without them, we will just see all the continuing adverse effects of climate change unmitigated, which itself will be a far greater and far more predictable disaster than some of the experimental stuff that we need to take forward in Wales in order to be able to reach our collective ambitions for a renewable energy future.
Thank you very much. And there's a real emphasis there on investing in the monitoring, because that's the challenging bit of the marine environment, because it tends to be quite difficult and expensive to do. So I take your point on that. It's really important. A different question here now, which links to your point around environment and social justice together. We've seen big public uprisings in response to the Black Lives Matter movement over the last few years. The Green movement has often been challenged for not being terribly inclusive. And we know that the impacts of climate change and the threats of unstable, non-resilient environments often impact hardest on those people who are not, who have the least in society, which can be, you know, class, finance, all of the different factors that affect social inclusivity. What do you think your advice would be to make the recovery a green and inclusive recovery in Wales?
Well, I think the first thing is to take some confidence from the changes that we have seen already. I think looking forward, cultural change always seems incredibly daunting, doesn't it? However, do you manage to change ways in which people behave and have behaved for many years? But sometimes I think we forget how even in our own lifetimes, we have seen major cultural change. So I sometimes tell a story in a slightly different field of being at the Ely Festival in my constituency here in Cardiff. So an annual festival, big festival field, big event on the final Saturday. And there we were running our little stall as usual. And somebody came up to it. And one of the younger people who were helping to run the stall said to me, really quite sort of, shocked, sort of whisper, "That person is smoking." And we just stood, the four of us, and did a sort of visual survey of the festival field, and we couldn't see anybody else who was smoking. And I can tell you, when I first went to Ely Festival in the 1980s, everybody was smoking, and not just outside, in the tea tent, in the creche, wherever people just, and somehow in 30 years, we have succeeded in creating a culture and a climate where people know that that's not acceptable and behave differently. And I think if you stood on that field in the 1980s and said to somebody, in 30 years' time, you'll come here and nobody will be smoking, people would have said, "You're just mad. You just can't do it like that." But, I think recycling would be another example. When I first came to Cardiff in 1979, if you carried your own bin to the end of the path and put it by the door, you ready to be collected, you thought you'd done your bit for the environment. And here we are now, all of us spend our time sorting, putting it in the right bin, getting it ready, taking it out. And that's how we've got to the levels we've reached. And as I said, that's a big cultural shift, isn't it? And it isn't just people who have a predisposition to think in environmental terms. It's now being done on a much wider basis. So I think the first thing is just to take a bit of inspiration from that and feel that we can do it. But we then have to, I think, to talk to people in terms that connect these things to everyday life. And that's why as I said, those practical actions that the group is focused on are so important. So to give you an example of that, the work of the Canal and Rivers Trust seems to me a really good example of this in Wales, because canals run through working class communities. And they are fantastic natural resources. And the Trust has put a lot of effort, I know, into trying to make sure that these are attractive green spaces for people who live near to them to appreciate and to use. And that's a way of connecting these agendas directly with the lives of people who we fear we struggle to take along with us. So it's having confidence in those communities, finding ideas that connect to their everyday lives, and then creating a climate, a set of practical actions that allow those things to happen together.
Yes, it's a real combination in those big changes you mentioned of legislation, targets, kind of community social pressure, as well as people encourage each other, and quite often children playing a lead role. I certainly know the recycling has been led by children as well. I've got a very topical question here about exiting the EU, and there's some concern around the future of trade deals that we do and whether this could risk lowering the ambitions we have in Wales around environmental and animal welfare and food safety standards. The news in the weekend around a UK internal market, I think, has meant people quite concerned that there's no environmental representation on this trade commission that's been set up. Do you have any thoughts on that for us?
Well, I'm afraid on this one, I'm much less optimistic, because I think we're right to be very worried. For a reason that I don't fully understand, the UK government seems to me to have done a sort of handbrake turn on the way in which these things were being resolved. So I understand the need for an internal market. I understand the need for rules-based trade and so on. I'm in favour of all of that. And the Welsh Government has worked very hard over the last 3 years with the previous UK government on things called common frameworks. So common frameworks are ways of reaching agreement between the 4 nations of the United Kingdom on the way in which we will need to have common standards, ways of interacting with one another, independent arbitration mechanisms. If Scotland were to believe that Wales was not operating a common framework in the way that was intended, then there needs to be somewhere you can go to have that looked at independently. And we have spent hour after hour at official level and at political level as well, working away at these common frameworks, which is a way of resolving these issues by agreement. Now, coronavirus has got in the way of that work. It has slowed down. It hasn't got to where we would have got to without coronavirus. But in the middle of all of that, the UK government's white paper suddenly resolves these matters by just saying, well, no, the UK government will decide all the rules. The UK government will impose those rules on everybody else. And if anybody else doesn't like the way these rules are being implemented, then the UK government will be the arbitrator. Now, that is completely unacceptable constitutionally, but the reason we're worried about it is not, we're worried about it constitutionally. It drives a coach and horses to very important parts of the devolution settlement. But we're more worried about it because of what it means in practice. Because in the white paper, if Scotland, let us say, were to allow the importation of food produced to standards that are well below the environmental and animal health standards that we currently expect in Wales, this white paper says is that Wales would have no choice but to allow those goods to be sold in Wales. So a decision on any one part of the United Kingdom becomes a decision made for all. And that is a race to the bottom, to my mind. And we've spent a decade and more with Welsh agriculture building up its reputation as based on high standards, high welfare standards, high environmental standards. And the white paper just sets all of those completely to one side. So sorry to sound bleak about it. We will respond, obviously, to the white paper. We will make our case. We will try and influence the outcome. But we are in a much worse place today than we were even a couple of weeks ago, when the work on the common framework still was the way in which we were seeking to resolve the genuine issues that are there in creating a stable, reliable, properly rules-based and policed internal markets.
I'm sorry to end us then on what might be a rather bleak note. There was one other question which I'll ask you if you've got a very quick answer to, which said the First Minister has always been very strong on individual action and everyone playing their part. What's your individual action to support nature recovery? Was a question which I'll give you a few moments, because then I'm going to thank you very much and hand over to Justin, because I'm aware the time is marching on.
Okay, whenever you're asked a question of that sort, you're immediately baffled by it, aren't you? Thinking of anything. Well, my allotment is in better shape this year than most years as a result of coronavirus, because partly the need just to find some time to get away, and but also the fact that allotments in Cardiff, I'm very pleased to say, were kept open right through lockdown. It was one of the few things you could cycle from your home and spend an hour to work on. So it's a very small contribution indeed. But as I say, at least it is in better shape this year than in many years when those opportunities have been harder to come by.
Brilliant. I very much have enjoyed my allotment, and I've been only about 3 feet from my favourite robin for much of the time, who follows me around. It's very good for my mental health too. Thank you very much, First Minister, for joining us today. Time has cracked on, so I'm going to hand straight over to Justin Albert to introduce us to the rest of the festival and what we've got to look forward to.
Thank you, Katie Jo. Thank you, First Minister. It is an honour. I mean, Katie Jo is, as you know, a rock star of the environmental movement in Wales, and a phenomenal partner for all of us to deliver. We don't always agree on everything, but you know what? That's the element of Wales, is if we can get our partnerships working like we do, Katie Jo and I do, we'll be in a great place. And First Minister, you and make me proud to be Welsh. And I mean that in an optical way, that we in Wales have that wonderful USP advantage around our land, our language, our culture, our future well-being of future generations act, and around justice. To hear those 3 pillars around justice is what makes Wales special. You also mentioned that there will be no new normal, that moving forward, that we'll have a post-crisis world, and that world must be better. I believe part of that world will be, must be around renewable energy, and must be around ways of investing in it, because as David Attenborough said, we've never taken a planet and put it in an oven before and turned it up to 10 and see what happens to it. And we're superheating our planet. And yes, COVID-19 is a disaster on so many, many, many levels, but it is the climate emergency, as we all know, and you've been so eloquent about, is a factor several times greater that will affect many generations coming down. And I guess in Wales, we can lead the way. We must lead the way. And I think that in the past, what's hampered us is the inability to work collectively in partnerships. We're small enough, we're smaller than Birmingham, but we sometimes don't come together to deliver collectively what we do. We concentrate on the 10% or 20% we don't agree with, rather than the 8% we do agree with. And I think that this is going to be something that we'll see over next week. Anyway, I should have said who I was. I'm Justin Albert. I'm Director for the National Trust. And in Wales, I'm honoured to be there. I live 20 miles away from where we should be right now, not far from where Katie Jo grew up as well, a place called Clyro by Hay-on-Wye, where you went there. And I live on the family farm that my sister runs, that has taught me that the balance between superb conservation and superb farming will create the outcomes we need. And over the last 9 years running the trust, I have seen increasingly that partnership between farming and conservation delivering for Wales. And we have to remember, in what is the Royal Welsh Show, that only through farmers will we deliver the conservation gains and benefits, but only through conservation will farmers be able to deliver a secure future for themselves. So what do we have? We brought together 9 Welsh food farming organisations and environmental charities to deliver this unique festival. And you're right about Hay. Hay was an extraordinary festival. I lived just down the road and involved with it, in which normally you would have a room listening to your First Minister with 300-400 people. To have 10 times that and then be downloaded another 10 times means Wales is on the map. What we are saying is on the map. And I've heard more about well-being of future generations from around the world as a Welsh American than I've ever heard before from that conversation you had at Hay. Thank you. So this festival is going to concentrate on many things, but I think the four major themes we're going to try and achieve is today we're going to look at green recovery. And there's going to be a talk with Katie Jo and the CLA and the Woodland Trust and National Trust Wales at 11 o'clock. On Tuesday, looking at the future of food systems, something I'm very passionate about, having seen vats in America grow meat muscle that tastes like hamburger. And I've seen hydroponics 5 stories high. That's where food may well come in the future. So where's Wales' place in this? Wales's place is producing extraordinary farming techniques that delivers as an alternative to that. On Wednesday, we have nature-based solutions. And on Thursday, to sum up the whole thing, we will have debates around the way forward, First Minister. And I do hope you'll be part of that and listening to it. Given time, I'm going to wrap up now, but we're very fortunate to have a video note from Leslie Griffiths, your Minister for Environment, Energy and Rural Affairs. It's a very long title, but she's very able at doing it. So without further ado, thank you, Katie Jo. Thank you, First Minister. Thank you all who've organized this extraordinary festival. And I'm really looking forward to the next 4 days. Diolch. Diolch yn fawr.
Yeah, however, thank you very much, everyone.
Hwyl fawr.